Being invaded by the Nazi army at its peak must have been a harrowing experience. The Nordic countries Norway and Denmark endured occupations for over 5 years during the course of World War II. Women and children, in particular, experienced tumultuous moments. In today's video, we will review the living conditions in both nations, while the forces of the Führer controlled society and its individuals, spreading terror in the hearts of these people. Welcome to a new installment of military history. The Nazi occupations in countries like Poland and France were truly savage and devastating for local societies. The resentment that Hitler and his troops harbored towards these nationalities was notorious due to the delirium of racial superiority advocated by the values of the Third Reich. However, invasions of other territories such as Norway and Denmark were quite different in terms of levels of violence and brutality. A possible explanation for this unusual Nazi behavior may be found in the fact that Germans considered the Danes and Norwegians as ethnically equivalent. According to the Third Reich's perspective, these Nordic peoples were deemed to possess an acceptable racial purity, which ensured a relatively autonomous handling during the German occupation. In the case of Denmark, its geographical position and small size made the defense of this territory against Allied attacks relatively straightforward for the Nazis. Since it was not susceptible to becoming a front line, Nazi control was more relaxed and did not require a violent restructuring of society. The situation was different in Norway, which had an extensive western coastline, making it vulnerable to attacks from the formidable British fleet. While the control exerted by Hitler's troops was not initially violent, they were much more cautious regarding militarization and defense of the occupied territory. Both invasions were carried out in an orderly manner on April 9, 1940, forever changing the history of these two countries. Let's see how the official Nazi communication unfolded.
In den Morgenstunden des 9. April landeten zum Schutze der norwegischen und dänischen Neutralität in zahlreichen Häfen Norwegens und Dänemarks deutsche Truppen. Eine in der Seekriegsgeschichte beispiellose Leistung. An Bord eines der Transportschiffe, kurz vor Beginn der Aktion. Die letzte Befehlsausgabe.
Just a month after Hitler's planned advance, the Scandinavian countries were under the power of the Führer. The purpose of this strategic advance, beyond the territorial hunger that characterized Nazi Germany from its beginnings, was to seize the natural resources of both lands. The Nazis primarily coveted the iron ore in the region, crucial for the armaments industry of the Third Reich. As the war progressed and internal weaknesses began to emerge, Nazi control over the occupied territories became more severe. In Denmark, starting in 1942, due to the rise of communist and pro-Jewish clandestine movements, German officers in the country began trying to calm the situation by exerting police terror. Contrary to their plans, acts of sabotage, riots, and Danish resistance increased. This escalation led to the Nazis dissolving the local government in 1943 and taking control of Danish society. This resulted in the persecution and deportation of Jews to German concentration camps, although a significant number managed to escape to Sweden, avoiding becoming part of the Holocaust. However, 450 Jewish individuals were captured by the Gestapo and sent to their deaths. Himmler's SS forces established special courts to judge Danes accused of supporting anti-Nazi resistance, typically resolving to assassinate suspects without trial. By 1944, Danes who identified as Nazis organized themselves into a task force called the Schalburg Corps, consisting of 10,000 members, equivalent to a packed amphitheater. This force conducted operations against traitors in cooperation with the SS, which had already co-opted the Danish police apparatus. They destroyed belongings, homes, and farms of individuals suspected of supporting local resistance sabotage, followed by executions to teach a lesson to society. It was a squad dedicated to hunting enemies of the state, as if they were hounds chasing defenseless hares. In contrast, in Norway from the beginning of the occupation, Legislation was modified in the German style to ensure the presence of Norwegian Nazis in almost all mass organizations in the country. Thus, unions, state forces, and government positions were infiltrated by the forces of the Führer. Political parties were banned, and laws against Jews were enacted to facilitate their denunciation and deportation. Similar to Denmark, many managed to escape thanks to pockets of resistance and Swedish collaboration, significantly reducing the victims of anti-Semitism. During the occupation, over 300,000 German soldiers settled in Norway to deter a possible British invasion. The images from that time are striking. In both countries, a phenomenon of fraternization between the local population and the occupying Nazis occurred, which seems logical when analyzed without prejudice. Many German soldiers were young individuals fighting for the honor of their homeland, and some were forced into it. Not all recruits were fervent Nazi fanatics. On the other hand, many Danish men were working or had been relocated in the territory, leaving many women alone working in their homes, often guarded by German troops, leading to romances with German soldiers. For some, these were just passing adventures, but in other cases, marriages occurred, and in many instances, children were born. However, the majority of these couples were forced to abruptly end their relationships in May 1945, when Nazi Germany surrendered and the occupied territories regained independence. Let's see the jubilation of the Scandinavian people on that day in the following archival material.
British airborne forces have had the most welcome duty of carrying out the official liberation of the oppressed countries of Scandinavia, beginning with Denmark's capital, Copenhagen. As the planes touch down at the Kastrup airport, there's a joyful rush forward by Danish patriots, who ever since the German occupation have been waiting and hoping for this great moment.
Although this should have been a cause for celebration, it meant an unprecedented nightmare for women who had fraternized with German soldiers. Locals, derogatorily calling these girls German girls, subjected them to severe reprisals, accusing them of working for the enemy and betraying their homeland. The measures taken were truly drastic, ranging from arrests, dismissals, and loss of wages to persecution, harassment, physical abuse, and violence. A graphic example of the punishment suffered by women in the occupied Nordic countries is this series of photographs taken during the liberation of Denmark, illustrating how groups of men surrounded and abused women accused of having sexual relations with Germans. The black and white images depict the anger and hatred that the Danes felt towards anything associated with the German occupiers. This shocking album shows a young woman accused of being involved with a young German lieutenant being pursued, stripped, subjected to various physical abuses, and having swastikas painted on her skin before being left exposed in a park for everyone to see. They also wrote the Danish word sticker, meaning spy, on their bodies, implying that these young women acted as spies. Men accused of being spies or Nazi collaborators faced the same fate. The images show suspects being taken at gunpoint by Danes to be detained and punished during the German occupation. In a more serious case, a man tried to escape in a vehicle and was stopped by a group of enraged Danes, who riddled the car with bullets. In the registration photo, the passenger seat is soaked in blood, giving an idea of how the hunt ended. According to the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies, between 30,000 and 50,000 women faced reprisals after the end of World War II. A similar number is estimated to have suffered mistreatment in Denmark. More than 70 years later, the Norwegian state apologized to the victims for allowing, and in some cases directly encouraging, attacks on these girls after the Nazi occupation ended. At that time, Norwegian authorities violated the fundamental principle that no citizen can be punished without trial or convicted without law, allowing civilians to take justice into their own hands. Similarly, the Norwegian state, along with the French and Dutch, detained and publicly shaved these young women as a form of exemplary punishment before sending them to prisoner camps for forced labor. We share an archive with you about what happened in the Netherlands to illustrate the grotesque situation. These women, humiliated, intimidated, violated, and in isolated cases directly executed, committed no crime. Many only experienced teenage love, while others found the love of their lives in an enemy soldier. In either case, none deserved the punishment and harassment they received. Furthermore, this situation highlights the sexist views of those times, as 28 Norwegian men married Nazi German women during the occupation, and none received any punishment from the state. Many of the children born from unions between local women and Germans were born in clinics known as Lebensborn, or Fountains of Life, created by the SS director Heinrich Himmler. These institutions were sinister nurseries with the goal of preserving and enhancing the Aryan race through the reproduction of German and Scandinavian women with selected members of the SS. To be part of this process, certain indispensable medical requirements had to be met. Women underwent a medical examination, measuring physical and mental attributes according to Nazi standards, as well as a racial test to verify the Aryan purity of the mother and her suitability for conception. A fundamental requirement was that both parents had to provide documentation proving that neither had Jewish ancestors for at least 3 generations. Himmler's motto was that every SS man before heading to the battlefield must leave behind the seed of a child. The most fervent Nazi soldiers believed they were doing their country a favor by donating their child to the Führer. In the soldiers' own words, it was uncommon for Lebensborn clinics to be established in territories occupied by the Nazis, but an exception was made in the case of Norway and Denmark, because the populations of these countries were intimately linked to the Germans through their Viking ancestry. For this reason, children born of Scandinavian mothers and German fathers automatically became property of the Third Reich, as they considered these racially superior children to be owned by the Nazi government. You may be wondering, if the punishment inflicted on the mothers was so spectacular, what happened to the babies of Nazi parents? These children, estimated to be between 10,000 and 12,000 according to the records of the time, were also targeted by local authorities. Just as the women were the German girls, these infants were vulgarly known as enemies' children. Essentially, they were treated as second-class citizens, deprived of education and medical care, and in extreme cases, denied citizenship. In the most severe instances, they were separated from their families and relocated to government institutions. In these establishments, they suffered various abuses that were silenced by the state at that time. What you are about to hear may be horrifying. An example of such mistreatment occurred in a notorious children's home in Trysil, southern Norway. In this place, children were subjected to a routine of torture, where they were tied to their beds at 4 in the afternoon and forced to remain still until 8 in the morning the next day. They were forbidden from using the bathroom, often soiling themselves and lying in their own feces, until the next morning when they were rudely awakened with a bucket of water. Another practice was that the enemy's children were force-fed, and if they vomited the food, they were forced to eat it again. Over time, these young individuals grew up without anyone ratifying the atrocities to which they were exposed, and many of them ended up taking their own lives. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the Norwegian state acknowledged these atrocities. On the other hand, Danes and Norwegians also punished Nazi prisoners of war in grotesque and dangerous ways. A common practice was to force them to clear mines installed in the territory after the war ended. This story was brought to light by Danish filmmaker Martin Zandvliet in the 2015 film Land of Mine, from which we will use some images to illustrate the tragedy.
Können Sie alle das schwarze Fähnchen da unten sehen? Jawohl, Herr Kollege! Zwischen dem schwarzen Fähnchen und dem Feldweg liegen 45.000 Minen. Ihr wird sie allen schaffen. Wenn ihr das erledigt habt, könnt ihr nach Hause gehen.
More than 2,000 captive German soldiers, many of them under 20 years old at the time, were forced to march through mined fields to clear them, putting their lives at risk. Many died performing this task, with no justification other than the trial less punishment established by the authorities of the countries. These actions are now known by historians specializing in the region as the greatest war crime committed by Nordic countries. As a consequence of these tragic events, throughout most of the 20th century, the societies of Denmark and Norway experienced a significant increase in violence. Not only did thefts rise due to the post-war economic crisis, but sexual crimes also doubled. According to professionals studying this phenomenon, this occurred because Danish and Norwegian men needed to reaffirm their dominance over the women of their land, who had been violated by a foreign invader. As illogical as it may sound, this is how the collective unconscious of societies operates, especially after a traumatic experience such as a world war or a Nazi occupation. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's video, but before we conclude, we wanted to ask you, do you believe that these atrocious historical events have affected present-day Nordic societies? We appreciate you staying until the end and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.